Welcome to part 2 of the Equal Opportunities Commission's panel discussion on human rights and age discrimination. I am Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard. Returning with me in studio is Mr. Haran Ramkaran Singh, and joining us is our second guest, Nala Prasad Pulaya, Executive Director of the National Insurance Board of Trinidad and Tobago. I'd like to welcome both of you to the set and to this panel discussion. And I'd like to begin my questions by asking Mr. Ramkaran Singh about the EOC and the importance of the new legislation that makes provision for age as a status ground in discrimination practices. Could you speak to this in the context of the Commission?
Yes. As we were discussing in part 1 of our panel discussion, the Equal Opportunity Commission is governed by an Act of Parliament, the Equal Opportunity Act. That Act seeks to prohibit certain kinds of discrimination. It applies to discrimination in 4 broad categories, that is employment, education, the provision of goods and services, and the provision of accommodation. However, that discrimination should be tied or connected to what are called status grounds. The Act protects certain 7 status grounds: race, ethnicity, religion, sex, marital status, disability, and geographical origin. So in other words, what the Equal Opportunity Act is concerned about is, for example, discrimination in employment on the basis of your sex, on the basis of your race, on the basis of your ethnicity. The thinking behind the Equal Opportunity Act is that decisions when it comes to things like employment and education should be based on merit and ability and not on a person's race, not on a person's sex or where they come from, their origin, or whether or not they have a disability. It envisages a society that's free from these sorts of considerations, where persons are taken at their merit. Age is not included as a status ground, and we have recommended that age be added as a status ground because, again, in keeping with the thinking of a merit-based society, where decisions are not based on your race or not based on your ethnicity. Similarly, decisions by an employer or a provider of goods and services or a provider of accommodation should not be based on a person's age. Specifically with respect to age, we see that, for example, it applies more so in the case of employment. Persons may not be recruited because of their age, or they may not be considered for promotion or for training, but that should not be relevant to an employer's decision-making process. Persons who may be older, for example, might have much to contribute to the organization. They may have a wealth of institutional knowledge. They may have much to bring. And they should be able to bring these things to the table without consideration. In the same way that they can bring things to the table without regard to their sex or their race or their ethnicity, they should be able to contribute to the organization or to any institution without regard to their age.
Are there jurisdictions outside of Trinidad and Tobago where this proposed legislation with respect to age as a status ground, are there jurisdictions where this has actually been made law?
Yes. For example, the Equal Opportunity Act, we are unique in the English-speaking Caribbean, but in other jurisdictions across the world, they have similar anti-discrimination legislation. For example, in England, there's the Equality Act. In America, they have the Civil Rights Act. Canada, all of the provinces in Canada have individual acts. And then there's a Canadian Human Rights Act. Similarly, in Australia, which is a federal country, all of the individual states or territories have respective legislation. In Hong Kong, there is an Age Discrimination Act, as well as there's a federal Australian Age Discrimination Act. So that all of these countries are have moved away from applying age as a status ground, or as a ground for consideration. As a matter of fact, for example, in England, they have consolidated all of their legislation in 2010 under an Equality Act. And one of the things that Equality Act did is that it abolished the mandatory retirement age, because age we see more often, more so with older persons not being recruited into an organization, and at the same time sometimes being forced out of an organization because they have reached a mandatory retirement age. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, if you're 60 years old, you're effectively terminated from the public service on account of a mandatory retirement age. Yeah. Whereas in the past in England, although they made provision for age discrimination, they kept that exception for mandatory retirement age. They have since moved away from that, and other countries are also moving away from a mandatory retirement age.
Okay, I'd like to turn my questions now to Niala. as the Executive Director of the National Insurance Board of Trinidad and Tobago, you are principally responsible for managing the social security system of the nation. Could you tell us a bit about the management of this system and the importance of this proposed legislation on that system?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting the NIB to be part of this very significant discussion, because any discussion with respect to age, of course, impacts on our national insurance system and the National Insurance Fund. The NIB, of course, is a social insurance organization. We manage and administer a social insurance fund. It's a very simple fund in sense of we collect contributions from employers and employees. We, of course, make prudent decisions in the investment of those funds, and we pay benefits at a time when people need it the most. So we cover the most vulnerable in our society. So when I listen to my very learned friends speak about including age in the Act, of course there's the advantages and the disadvantages to that. But I wanted to, in terms of inquire from him whether we were looking at, I understand that you said you were looking at it globally, but have we really looked at the global aging population syndrome, which is affecting us all in terms of you making a decision that you would like to bring age on in the Act? Have we looked at it specifically in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, or have we looked at it in terms of the Caribbean and outside of the Caribbean? And the reason I asked that, Dr. St. Bernard, is that, of course, there is something called the aging population syndrome. In fact, the United Nations has defined the aging population syndrome as wherever you have more than 10% of your population above age 60, it is seen as an aging population syndrome. And in Trinidad and Tobago, from our data at the NIB, and of course collected with CSO, the aging population, at this point we're at about 14%, where 14% of our population is over the age of 60. And it is projected to go to about 30% in about 2060. So any discussion of age, of course, will impact on the National Insurance Fund.
Well, from where I sit as a demographer, we keep talking about 60 is the new 50 and 70 is the new 60. And I would think, given this kind of development, that perhaps there would be a need to increase the retirement age. What are your perceptions and positions with respect to the prospect of increasing the retirement age? And of course, there are other dimensions to this, because what I am actually envisaging, if we don't perhaps increase the retirement age, what it may mean is that we will have to depend on migration as a means of bringing persons of working age to fuel the social security system, as it were. So I don't know. I would like to get your feelings on increasing the retirement age and what you think might be the benefits of that.
All right. So let's just put this in a little bit of a perspective. At present, the NIB pays retirement pension to approximately 96,000 persons on a monthly basis. And when I speak about the aging population syndrome, as I said before, it is not unique to the NIB, TT. Mm-hmm. It is a global syndrome.
It's a global.
And so it's affecting all of us. And when you look at the projections, if, for example, we have 14% of our population right now is over the age of 60, and that is intended, or that is projected to increase to 30% in 2060, then what we're faced with, the challenge that we are faced with at the NIB, and as I said globally, is increasing benefit expenditure and decreasing contribution income. So at present, the ratio of persons paying into the system is approximately 4.5 persons paying into the system to support one pensioner or one retiree. In 2060, it is projected to flip, where we have 1.6 persons paying into the system to support the payment of one retiree. So you have to understand the pressures of the fund. And for example, when I speak about the fact that we would have paid $96,000 in 96 benefit expenditure would have been to 96,000 persons, our benefit expenditure for the year ending June 30th, 2015 exceeded $4 billion. And with an aging population, in fact, our projections as at 2014, with the database that we have at the NIB, it was projected that approximately 144,000 persons will reach retirement age within the next 5 years. So what we're looking at, as I said, from an aging population point of view, is thousands of other persons joining into the queue, waiting to receive a retirement benefit. That is precious in our fund. And when we speak about moving the retirement age, of course, we must start with the mandatory retirement age. In the public service, from what I understand, most persons retire at age 60. That is the mandatory age of retirement. In the National Insurance Act, the retirement age is 65. You understand? So we have persons who would have retired at age 60, and retirement age is 65. Now, the NIB allows persons who would have ceased insurable employment at age 60, they are allowed to make their claim and receive a retirement benefit at age 60. So when we talk about retirement age, or including age in the Act, we must speak about the mandatory retirement age, we must speak about the pressures it will have on the fund and the projections. We have just actually come out of the 9th actuarial review. An actuarial review is done every 5 years at the NIB. In fact, the board would have made a decision that it should be done every 3 years. And that really looks at the assessing the benefits and contributions into the system. The 9th actuarial review would have made several recommendations, some short-term, some long-term, all aimed, of course, at sustaining the fund and the longevity of the fund. You may or may not know that we have since adopted 2 of the short-term measures, which are to increase the contribution rate and to increase the maximum insurable earnings, all of which is intended, of course, to sustain the fund. But there are some critical discussions that must be held with respect to the retirement age. And as I said, national dialogue is required. The actuarial review did make certain recommendations in terms of moving the retirement age from 60 to age 65 over a projected period of time. And naturally, any discussion on retirement age will require national dialogue, extensive stakeholder consultation, and it is not an overnight remedy to the solution. It's not it will not provide an overnight solution. So our position at the NIB is that it must be a mixture of reform measures, short-term and long-term, in terms of sustaining the fund. When we do look at some comparisons, for example, Barbados is known to have a high mature population, and they have already gone ahead. They have gone ahead to move their retirement age from 60 to 65. In fact, I think they're moving to 67. Similarly, with St. Vincent, they have gone ahead also to move to 65. When we look even at places like Canada and Germany, they have invested millions of dollars in public education, sensitization, to try to move their retirement age to benefit the fund. And there's also merit in moving, there's merit too in terms of at 60, most persons are the pinnacle of their careers. They have so much to share, so much experience, so much organizational knowledge and transfer, etc. That is key. So there are pros and cons to both of it. But in terms of the NIB, when we speak about including age, of course, we must look at the retirement age, the mandatory retirement age, the retirement age that is in the Act, and of course the sustainability of the fund and the demands that making that change will have on the fund and the sustainability of the fund.
When one looks at longevity of life, for example, persons are living longer. And not only are persons living longer, but persons are living healthier lives at older ages. So there is some evidence in terms of, one's capability to sustain life. Not to mention the fact that younger cohorts are in the labor force with higher levels of human capital than their predecessors. So there are all those arguments that really support, in a way, increasing the mandatory age for retirement. Are there any obstacles that are really preventing that from happening.
And we must celebrate that too. We must celebrate the fact that we have in this beautiful twin island, that we have so many citizens that are healthier, that are living longer, etc. But of course, the flip side to that is the demands that it will place on the sustainability of the fund. In terms of challenges, how do you foresee any challenges in terms of including age into the Act?
Well, firstly, there has to be the will to do it in terms of passing the amendments and government putting in the necessary provision, for example, policies and practices. And not just governments, but let's look at an employer. If you have an employee who's over 60, you may have to invest some more in retraining that employee with new technologies. You may have to also consider. While persons are living longer and healthier lives, persons over the age of 60 may have increasing demands on healthcare. So you may, as an employer, you may have to look at thinking, well, do I have to give this person flexi time? Or not what do I have to, but should I give this person flexi time? Should I make allowances for this person, if they need to have some personal commitments? Should I now start employing persons on a part-time basis? For example, one of the steps that could happen in the public sector is moving towards employing persons on a part-time basis, but you have the public service regulations, which tell you that you must be at work from 8 to 4 or 4:15 or that sort of thing. So that some of the challenges would be in implementing it in these sorts of rigid employment structures that we have. So I think that is something that policymakers would have to look at. So there is need for a wider discussion. You just can't simply say, well, let's do away with the mandatory retirement age or just like that. You do have to have a discussion on it and see what sort of systems are you going to put into place to support a working older population.
Well, when we speak about challenges too, Dr. St. Bernard, I guess I can't overstate the fact that national dialogue is required. And I think it starts here, it starts with us, because it's not just about public policy or the government policy, but it is about these discussions that are critical to increasing the awareness and the engagement and the sensitization, the public education that is required in terms of the merits and the challenges, what are the pros, what are the cons kind of thing. But what I wanted to understand too in terms of, yes, age is a good thing to include in the Act, but what is driving it? What is the driver of including age? Other than the fact, is it that we are mirroring somebody from in the Caribbean or Canada? So what's the driving factor behind including age in the Act?
Well, apart from, for example, persons over the age of 60, we have, the Commission receives complaints from members of the public, and we have received complaints over the years of persons claiming that they are being discriminated because of their age. And unfortunately, the Commission cannot assist these persons because it's not part of our status grounds, but it is an area where members of the public feel aggrieved about, so that it has to do with their human rights as a citizen. Because the Equal Opportunity Act is concerned, it is a human rights instrument. It is concerned with prohibiting discrimination on a number of grounds. So that, for example, we have an act that says, you should not be discriminated against and we have gone through the status grounds on your race, your disability, and what have you. But age is an area where citizens also feel aggrieved. They feel discriminated against. If, for example, an employer tells you, well, we're not going to consider you for some training or some promotion because you're close to retirement, or we're not going to consider recruiting you because you're of a certain age, then that could, by and of itself, be that is a form of age discrimination. The employer should really look at your merits and your abilities. For example, if it is that you're recruiting someone for the post of a bus driver, realistically you may not want to hire an 80-year-old person to do that job. But at the same time, well, on the flip side, if the person has 20/20 vision and they have a medical report that says they have perfect eyesight and perfect cognitive skills and perfect reflexes, then there's no reason why they shouldn't be hired.
But on any day, there's positive discrimination. Let's face it. For example, as you would have said in part one of your session with respect to the driver's permit, a driver's permit there's a positive discrimination there in that you are entitled to apply for a permit at age 21, or you're entitled to exercise your franchise at age 21, because one would assume that at that age you're at an age of reasoning and logic, and that you would be employing some form of judgment. So there are positive discriminations that take place on any given day.
I am a little concerned too, because we are talking about making a critical decision, and I'm wondering to what extent there is some kind of formal research playing into some of these decisions that we are making, because you get the impression that a lot of this might be informed by individuals' gut feeling in many instances, but there has to be something more in terms of data collection. And I mean, the work of the National Insurance Board and the actuarial reviews and all the other things that have been done, have there been thoughts about, commissioning research exercises, formal research exercises to inform some of these decisions? Because as a nation, I think in many regards, we have often been blamed and labeled for not making decisions on the basis of research. Do you have any sort of comments that you can share on that?
Well, I will. Let me just clarify, because I would just want to clarify that point. The actuarial review is a statutory requirement. They are conducted every 3 to 5 years. It assesses the balance of contributions and to benefits. So it is our guide. It provides accurate projections on statistical data. It gives us in terms of demographics, where we are now, where we expect to be, etc. So the NIB must seriously consider the projections that are made in the actuarial review. And of course, we don't do that in isolation. While we do have a database in-house, we do look at all the other sources of information in Trinidad and outside of Trinidad. So we would have gone to the CSO in Trinidad, but we would have also looked at our counterparts in Barbados, in the Caribbean, in Canada, etc., to see where those global trends are going. And as I said, Social Security is not unique to NIB. NIBTT. It is a global syndrome in terms of aging populations. And I think those discussions must commence, because, Dr. St. Bernard, it will feed into answering your question in terms of where are we getting this information from. I can sit here today and say to you, 14% of our population is over the age of 60, but what does that mean? We have to look at where we're going to go. So we're moving from 40% to 30%, meaning a higher category of persons over the age of 60, but a declining fertility rate, and less persons to contribute into the system. And those are global trends. Those are in the actuarial review, and they are global trends.
Well, in terms of the Equal Opportunity Commission, part of our mandate is to review the workings of the Act and make proposals for amendments. So we did some research into the area. Now, we did not commission an independent statistical survey. We rely on data compiled by other agencies, such as the CSO. We looked at publications from the Division of Aging, which actually did project an increase in the aging population, persons over 60, to, I think it was 30% by the year 2050.
2050 or so, yeah.
Yes, so that once you want to understand this changing demographic of our country, you'd understand that you start to ask yourself, well, what are the needs of this changing demographic? We looked at it in terms of amendments to the Equal Opportunity Act in terms of age discrimination, but there are also wider issues that this aging population will face. For example, they would need, you'll have to look at things like access to health care, access, and all of these sorts of things. How is this aging population going to support themselves if we have a declining birth rate and a declining fertility rate? So you would look at these sorts of questions, but at the same time, our focus was not only on this aging population, but on age discrimination generally, right, where persons feel that they are being denied certain benefits because of their age, especially, for example, employment, training, promotion, those sorts of things. At the same time, we did look at international trends. And one of the things we noted, and this was discussed in part one of our discussion, is that there may be instances where decisions may genuinely have to be based on age. Miala, for example, pointed out to the fact that a driver's permit, and we did discuss it in part one. So that whenever you're talking about age discrimination, while our trust is on retirement and the aging population, you also do have to balance it with other situations where there may be a genuine reason where you say, let us look at the age of a person. For example, again, if you have a person who's convicted of a criminal offense, persons who are considered minors are treated differently. They're placed in a different prison, for example. And so that might be a genuine situation where you say, well, a person under the age of 18 should not be treated the same way as an adult prisoner.
As I listen, I mean, a lot of what we are saying seems to be saying, well, okay, in Trinidad and Tobago, we are looking at the global picture. 14% of the population are persons currently over 60 years at this point in time. But from a sociological kind of perspective, one would imagine that it's not just about Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is divided into different communities. We talk about the regional corporations, the city of Port-au-Prince, Tobago, for example. And there would be differences as we move across these spaces. Not only are there the different spaces, but in terms of, different social characteristics. We speak about age as a status ground, but there are other status grounds that you can think of in terms of the type of work someone does, the type of family situation within which one lives, and so on. I'm asking the question if it is that you have evidence that would allow you to do that kind of deeper analysis, because what may work in one area of Trinidad and Tobago may not work in another area of Trinidad and Tobago, or what may work for one group may not work for another group in terms of, some of the decisions that are to be made with respect to the amendment. So I'm just throwing it out to see if there are any thoughts or have been any thoughts on that.
Well, in proposing the amendments, we didn't, again, we wouldn't go and commission an independent survey, but we would look at the complaints that we have been collecting over the years. We have been in operation since 2008, and over the years we've received over 1,100 complaints. So when we would disaggregate that data, and we would look at what people are complaining about. And although you might think that there are different groups and different persons in Trinidad, you do see a lot of commonalities and common threads running through these complaints.
And I think that's exactly the point I was trying to get at. Is there some kind of data collection with respect to the complaints? Because I think there's a lot that could be teased out there. And based on what you are saying, I think you have answered the question in a sense, because you are basically saying, given some of those status hierarchies that you might look at, you are not seeing the differences. This is what I'm getting from what you said. All right, I just got cues that, time is sort of moving on and we got to close up. So I would like to ask each of you if you have any closing comments you would like to make with respect to some of the issues we have been discussing here.
Okay.
Dr. St. Bernard, of course, we would like to thank you for inviting us. As I said before, the NIB is a key stakeholder in any discussion on age, because there's a direct impact on the national insurance system and the sustainability of the fund. The NIB is on a road to transformation. We are not only looking at our customer service initiatives, but we're looking at promoting the health of the fund. The 9th actuarial review did make some very startling recommendations. We have proceeded to implement the short-term recommendations, which would have been the amendment to the contribution rate and the maximum insurable earnings. And I am happy for the opportunity to commence the discussions on the long-term changes that are required to the Act. Those long-term reform measures vis-a-vis moving the retirement age, those discussions must commence on a national level. Key stakeholder engagement is required, and as I said before, it is a process that we must adopt, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. As I said, any discussion on age will involve the NIB and the sustainability of the fund for generations to come.
Thank you.
Yes, well, we have the Equal Opportunity Commission has made a recommendation that age be included. As is right now, we did not make a recommendation with respect to the mandatory retirement age because we had not engaged, or there has not been rather, any wider stakeholder discussion about it. It is a national issue, and this is something that I think that as a society we need to have further discussion about, because there has to be buy-in as well. It's one thing for us to say, let us move the mandatory retirement age up. But the reality is, for example, in the public sector, you have many people at the age of 59, they're just counting on the days. And if you tell a public officer who's counting on their days, that, okay, well, no, we're now going to move it to 65. They may not have, they won't buy into that.
won't buy into it.
But they need, so they need to see the wider picture as well. It's not about just about them retiring at age 60 and getting this lump sum of funds from the NIB and from what have you. They need to look at the wider, so there needs to be wider public education about these issues.
Well, at this point, I'd like to thank Mrs. Prasad Pulaya and Mr. Ramkaran Singh for their contributions to this panel discussion. I think you filled some important gaps. Thanks for watching the Equal Opportunity Commission's panel discussion on human rights and age discrimination. Till next time, thank you very much for your participation and engagement.